Genesis 4:1. It's just one verse. If you, I know we normally use the NLT, but if you actually use the NLT is a literal translation, but it doesn't give you the actual full meaning of the verse. So if you read Genesis 4:1 from the NLT, says, now Adam had sexual relations with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant. And when she gave birth to Cain, she said, with the Lord's help, I have produced a man. I prefer to actually read it from the ESV. ESV says, now Adam knew his wife. So the word that is translated as made love to, had sex with, actually means knew. And the idea is that in the Hebrew language, that word, I think it's pronounced Yoda, something like that. But that word actually means beyond just making love. It actually means knowing. It means to know, to learn, to know, to perceive and see, to distinguish, to know by experience, or to recognize, to admit, to acknowledge, to consider. So that word appears a couple hundred times in the Old Testament at least. And it's the same word that is used when in Genesis 3:7, when it says the eyes of both were opened and they knew they were naked. It's the same word. So knowing is just beyond, so, that word as used is beyond just intercourse. It also goes deeper than that. It connotes a relational knowing and not just a physical knowing. Same thing in Genesis 3:22. Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. It's the same word there that is used. It's the same exact word. So the word knowing, when it says Adam knew his wife, it's beyond just having sexual relations. It has a deeper context. This message actually is about staying welded, not wedded, welded, as in fused, welded together, staying welded. And it's not necessarily about good times. And I don't want it to apply only to marital relationships. Sorry, Linda. I don't want it to apply only to marital relationships. But I also wanted to...
you're on 4:1?
Yes, Genesis 4:1.
Okay.
Genesis 4:1. I don't want to apply to only marital relationships, but also to any relationship that is of value to you. Staying welded. There's some lessons here in staying connected and staying welded and continuing to know your spouse or somebody that you deem in a relationship that you deem qualitative and important. And the reason why I say this message is not necessarily about the good times is because if you think about the backdrop to Genesis 4, Genesis 4 is following closely on the heels of Genesis 3. And Genesis 3 records the fall of man. And when we studied that, we saw the story was very clear where they started playing the blame game. So God comes to Adam, and Adam says it's Eve that made him eat the fruit. And then Eve says it's the serpent that made her eat the fruit. So I just want you to imagine what that conversation was like. After God had cast them from the Garden of Eden, I can tell you if it was me, I know what that conversation would be like. The conversation I'd be having with my wife, if I was Adam, I'd be blaming her. Say, see what you see. See, look, the magnificent garden that your actions have made us to live. So when we were living in Ceres, we lived under a really harsh landlady. And from time to time, I continually blame my wife and say, it's your fault that we lived in that house for a year. And it's not a healthy conversation to have, by the way. But the idea just is when Adam and Eve are leaving that Garden of Eden, that wonderful, perfect place that God has set up for them, it's easy to imagine that both of them were fighting. And, Adam must have been blaming Eve, and Eve must have been blaming her. Look at what you did. See what you made me do. See what we have now lost. there must have been some chaos. There must have been some conflict in that relationship. And every relationship, necessarily has some kind of conflict. But whatever that backdrop is, whatever that conflict is, it's interesting to me that Genesis 4:1 starts with, now Adam knew Eve, his wife. Very often there are disagreements and problems and issues that lead people to separate. They lead relationships to end. In my job as a family law attorney, I hear it all the time. I hear people call all the time. I say, well, he's so stubborn. He doesn't listen anymore. I've tried to fix him. I've done everything I can do over the years, and he has just refused to change. So I'm done now. I want to get a divorce. And so there are always issues. There are always problems. There's always a reason to escape. But it's instructive that Adam and Eve stayed together. It's very interesting to me that Adam and Eve stayed together. And probably the reason why they stayed together is because they didn't have any options. They were all out of options. They're the only adult man and woman on earth. So if I leave you, who am I going to go be with? They had no options. And so there are some really, I would say, especially your marriages, you should treat them as if you are the only ones on earth. Like you don't have any options. You don't have anywhere else to go. You don't have any plan B. Because Adam and Eve, they didn't have a plan B. They had to stick it out. They had to stay together. So my first point to you is stay. Just stay. Remain. Things are not always nice. They're not always hunky-dory. They're not always fresh. But stay. Stay. And Adam and Eve stayed. They stayed. The Bible doesn't record any separation. Even when the earth was populated and Adam lived hundreds of years. Stay. Just stay. God instituted marriage not as a temporary relationship. God instituted it as a permanent one. And the first man and woman, even though they were the first people to introduce sin into the world, they had all these ugly consequences, they stayed. They stayed together. They stayed together. Okay, I wish I could broadcast this to all my future clients before they come to my office. I say, you know what, I have a conversation that you need to watch about. I might put this on my website. I might never get any more business in Ridgecrest again, but it is what it is. But yes, stay, okay? And it's not just to stay.
How about in an abusive situation?
We can talk about that. We can talk about that.
Okay.
But, if you raise the question in an abusive situation, actually, what you should do is you should report them to the authorities. Let me answer that right now. If you're in an abusive situation, the first thing you should do, because people who are in abusive relationships, they think that they are being loving by not talking. If you are in an abusive relationship, and I have those too, speak up, tell the police, tell the cops. If you need to get an attorney, do what you need to do. Very often, when people who are abusive get called out on it, they will use their hands to run away. They'll back out themselves. You don't even need to serve them divorce papers. They'll run away because people who are abusers are not comfortable being called out. America is actually the best place for you to do that. America, I work in the legal system, so I know that there are very stiff consequences. It's not like Nigeria, where I come from, where, if your spouse is beating you, you run home to your parents, and your parents will say, well, you know what, I beat your mother too, so go back. But here in America, if you abuse someone, you go right to the police and tell them, hey, listen, he punched me up the face. He will be a felon for life. He can't give his, in this town that we work in is a base town. If you have a domestic violence restraining order on your record, you can lose your job. So there are very high stakes for people not to behave like that. So I would say, if you are in an abusive, the first thing you should do, actually, you should report them to the police. You should say something, speak up. That's actually the godly thing to do, because God is not just a God of mercy and kindness, He's also a God of justice. So, yes, stay. And not just stay, but actually in your staying, love steadfastly. Don't just stay for staying sake. Some people sign out, right? They just log out, just like, well, I'm staying, whatever. The Bible said I should stay, so I'm going to stay. So it's not just stay, but when you stay, actually stay and love steadfastly. Don't check out. And I say this because I know it's easy even for me as a married man. It's easy for me to get checked out when your spouse, when your children annoy you, when people. It is very easy for you to check out of relationships and just go through the motions. And I'm saying, in the nature of God, love steadfastly. 1 John 4:19. 1 John 4:19. Okay. 1 John 4:19. I'm trying to try to track and show you actually when you love and when you stay. This is why you should love steadfastly, right? 1 John 4 is talking about loving one another. That's the message of 1 John. He's talking about loving God and how loving God actually translates into loving one another. And in 1 John 4:19, he says, we love because he first loved us. The origin, our ability to love, is grounded in the fact that God first loved us. He loved us first. He showed us how to love. He described us. He taught us how to love, first of all. That's why we can even love. So we love steadfastly, not because you are a loving person, but love because God first loved you. Love because God first loved you. Verse 20, if anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother, whom he sees, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. Again, it's pulling that relationship together. It's pulling those strings together. Like, listen, your love for your brother, your ability to love, it has to be grounded. If you can say, I love God, and you don't see God, how can you say, how can you have hate in your heart for your brother? How can you have hate in your heart for someone else? If you and say that you love God, meanwhile the person you can see, you can't love them. It doesn't add up. So your ability to love has to be, it's grounded in God. It's grounded in God's love for us. I'll move you around you don't have to turn there. I'll move you around to Psalm 86. I'll move you around to Psalm 86. Get another description of God's love. Okay, Psalm 86:15 gives a description. But you, O Lord, are a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. But you, O Lord, are a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger. See that one, that's the tough part, to be to not fly off the handle. But slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. So steadfast love means that it's there. It's just there. It's not shaking. It's not going away. It's steadfast. It's steadfast love and faithfulness. And then I'll top it off by actually going to Lamentations 3. Lamentations 3 is an interesting case study for me because in Lamentations, the book itself, Lamentations, is about the prophet lamenting God's judgment on the people of Israel. That's what Lamentations 3 is about. It's lamenting that God has allowed them to be overrun by their enemies. It's not a good time. It's not a good time. If you read the whole of Lamentations 3, for example, it starts with, I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath, has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. That's what the book of Lamentations is about. It's the prophet Jeremiah, I believe, saying, hey, God is taking it out on us. God is being hard on us. And listen, when in our relationships, in our marriages, in whatever, we have seasons, as the people had seasons here, where the relationship is not nice, where there is consequence that is happening, where consequences are occurring, because it's not just that God was punishing them for punishment's sake. There were consequences to the things that the people had done. And so when people are going through consequences, it's not fun. It's never fun. And that's what he's talking about in Lamentations. But when you actually come down to verse 22, in the middle of in verse 21, in the middle of all his lamentations and his complaining and his, this is how difficult it is. In verse 21, he says, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. So if our love is grounded in God, if we only love because he can love, it makes sense that we love in the nature, in the way, in the format that he loves. It makes sense for us to copy his style of loving, right? And in Lamentations, he says, listen, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, even in the midst of consequence, even in the midst of conflict. He still says the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Can you have that person in your life, whoever, can you have them have the mindset? Can you treat them and, allow them feel your love to the extent that in the midst of consequences, they can actually say that, you know what, this person still loves me. This person's love is steadfast. We're secure. Even though this might be a period of consequence, it might be a period where we're going through things, a period where things are not nice. Can we have that mindset of the other person? Can we trust? Can we have hope and say that the steadfast love of this Christian will never cease? It's just there. This is a rough time, or I'm ill, I'm sick, I can't do the things I used to do. Whatever it is, can we put ourselves in that space and make it so that our love is actually steadfast, that is unwavering? We treat your spouse like they are the only other person. That's literally what Adam and Eve were experiencing. They were the only other people in the world. No option, no plan B, no escape, nobody down the street, no nice neighbor, no milkman. They were the only ones available. Can you treat your brother like they are the only person available, like they're the only option, and make your love steadfast. Make your love steadfast. Okay. So the Bible records in Genesis 4:1, like I said, Adam knew his wife, and like we just talked about, the word knowing there is not just it's not just to connote sexual relations, but the knowing is to connote discernment, right? Is to connote knowing and involvement. Is beyond just a physical knowing, but also a psychological knowing. So can I encourage us to keep knowing each other? Keep knowing each other. Because relationships take work. They take relentless work, hardcore work. It's part of you should schedule time to build, and this is something I'm really, really bad with, but you should treat it, if you're going to treat it with the same priority that you treat your job, where your job takes 8 hours of your time, you should actually be devoting certain hours of your day to building and fixing and growing your relationships. You should take time to know. Now, Adam knew Eve, his wife. You should take time to know. I'm going to speak in a more literal term, in terms of couples. So there's the more kind of, if you will, non-physical aspects of knowing, but there's also the physical aspect of knowing. And spouses should continually know each other. I'm not going to shy away from that one. Spouses should continually know each other. My brother used to be I don't know if it was him or his pastor, but I remember hearing the story of, they'd be doing couples counseling. And when the couple comes and they come in for counseling and they're about to say all the horrible things that one spouse is doing to the other, the first question he always asks is, when last did you guys know each other? When last did you guys have relations? And if it has been long enough, they say, okay, you know what, before we have these conversations, you guys need to go home, copulate, and then come back and we'll have this conversation again. And my brother told me that it was surprising how much less the conflict was after couples had actually known each other, after they had copulated, after they'd had sex. It was surprising to him how much, when they came back, they were like, okay, maybe they will still have problems for sure, but the amount of anger, the amount of vitriol, the viciousness was always toned down a little bit after they actually went and were physical with each other. And there's a value to that. God created sex. Fine, he created it for the purposes of procreating, but he also created it to make married couples closer together. He created it to make them closer together. He created it to have a binding effect. the value of that physical connection. It's not by mistake. It's a very deliberate ploy. So when he says he knew his wife, it's not just the spiritual aspect, it's the physical knowing. And so keep doing it. 1 Corinthians, it's biblical. 1 Corinthians 7. Okay. 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul is talking about principles for marriage. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 1. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote. So it's like, the idea is that the church in Corinth probably wrote to Paul saying it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Verse 2. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So he's saying you cannot deprive your wife of your body. Your wife cannot deprive you of her body. Both of you don't have authority over these things. Give into each other. Verse 5, do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come back together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So he's saying, if you don't sleep with each other, let it be because you agree. So that means that actually, when you are in conflict sometimes, maybe that's the best solution that you should actually, it's not something that you should forsake. And it's very, very, very easy for people to get into that habit of, I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling you. But that's biblically, that's literally not what it says, because you are letting in temptation. You are giving room for temptation. So do not deprive one another. Very important. Don't deprive one another. So, yes, continue in the knowing. Continue in the knowing. Keep knowing your wife. Keep working at it. Keep working at those relationships. For people who are in friendships or relationships, it's the same thing. If you need to get on the phone and keep calling each other. If that's the way you guys keep the bond together, you have to get on the phone. And that one, as I'm saying it, I am judging myself because I am really bad at keeping in touch. I'm really bad at continually. Since I left Nigeria 8 years ago, there are people who I have not spoken to. And if they call me and say, oh, maybe they need money or something, I'm always happy to do that. But I know that our friendships and our relationships was about a lot more than sending dollars home. And it takes time, it takes effort. And we should just keep investing that time, that deliberation to know. And finally, recognize the hand of God at work. Recognize the hand of God at work in all things. Recognize the hand of God at work. So, in 4:1, in Genesis 4:1, she bore Cain, and Eve said, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. So these are the people, after God has cast them out of the garden, and they're now living they're living outside of Eden. And she conceives and she gives birth to a son. And she says, the acknowledgement is not for Adam. And Adam was there. I mean, I'm sure he was there for her to conceive. Adam was involved. Adam sowed the seed. But when she gave birth, she said, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Like, it's God that has given. And we should just be in that mindset where we attribute every situation to, even if it's a difficult situation, attribute it to something that God has allowed. Say, you know what? God is kind, He's loving, but He has allowed. This thing is only happening because God has allowed it. The flip side, this is a good example. This is a happy thing. This is a good thing that she had the child. So she's happy. Yes, I have gotten a man with the help of God. But there are times when people don't get what they want, and they still go back to God. Right? The way it's recorded, I like how it's recorded in the book of 1 Samuel. in 1 Samuel 1. 1 Samuel 1 is about how the prophet was born. And Samuel was born to his mother Hannah, and Hannah had been looking for a child before Samuel came. She'd been trying to get a child, and she couldn't get a child. Now, this is the way it is recorded. 1 Samuel 1, verse 4. On the day when Elkanah, Hannah's husband, sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Though the Lord had closed her womb. So, in certain cultures, they're like, she's infertile. She can't have, she's barren. She can't have children. She's barren. She can't, the other woman has been able to have children, but you can't have children. See, you're barren. You're barren. But actually, the Bible doesn't describe it as that. It says the Lord closed her womb. It attributes that negativity to God, saying, yes, she didn't have children, but it's not because of anything crazy. It's because the Lord closed her womb. The Lord closed her womb. So let's just be in that mindset where we attribute everything thankfully to God. So attribute everything thankfully to God. If it's a good time, if it's a rough time, if it's a horrible time, just realize that even in allowing things to happen, when you read the book of Job is about God allowing Satan to attack Job. He lost his wife. His body was riddled with sores. He was sick, and God allowed it. So if you're going through it, just keep your mind on God and say, you know what? Whatever this situation is right now, God is allowing it. And if it's good, it's like, well, this situation is good because God is blessing me right now. God is allowing, because that mindset is very important. It's very important because it's important so that we do not get bitter or resentful of each other, of ourselves. It is important to have that mindset that, everything is controlled, everything is run by God. Like God is the one, he has everything in the palm of his hand. And when you realize that, on a certain level, it might make you feel helpless and say, well, I have no control. But at the same time, it should make you feel secure that God has your back. It should make you feel very secure. You don't have the thing you want right now, but God has your back, and he has his reason, he has his timing. He's putting it all together, as the Bible says, for his own good. He's putting it all together. He's making it work for his own good. So keep that in mind. Keep God in mind. Keep him at the forefront. Isaiah 45:7. Okay. I form light. Isaiah 45:7. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and I create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. I am the Lord who does all these things. So he says, I make well-being and I create calamity. So, like God is saying, listen, attribute it all to me. But if you are in Christ, if you're in God, you know what? It's fine. It's fine. So, I just want to encourage us this morning with those words. Let's just all, stay. Yes, stay. When it's hard, stay. When it's hard, love steadfastly. And continually know the other person. Continually know your wife. If it's a marital relationship, if it's a relationship you value, continually know, work at it, and recognize the hand of God at work in all things. Let's pray.